Cole was 12 feet underground when his shovel hit something it had never hit before. Not the hard clay, not the crumbling red earth he had been dragging up by the bucket since before sunrise. Not the dry, packed, indifferent nothing that had been mocking him for 3 straight days. Water. Cold and clear and ancient, pushing up through the floor of that hole from a spring that had been sitting in that exact spot, in the dark, quietly feeding this land from below, for longer than any living person could count. Cole dropped the shovel. He stood there in the narrow dark, the walls of New Mexico earth pressing in on both sides, his hands split open, his back long past complaining, and he let that cold water rise against his boots. Then he sat down in the mud at the bottom of a 12-foot hole, and he cried. Not just from relief. The relief was real, and it was enormous. But that was not why he cried. He cried because of the man on the hill. Because that man had known the entire time. Had ridden down one single morning after 3 years of silence, pointed at this exact patch of ground near the northern fence, said 4 words, and turned his horse and left. The water is there. This is the story of Cole Barrett, a cattle rancher who came west with everything a man could be taught, and found out it was not nearly enough. It is the story of Nah-kah-yen, an Apache elder who watched from the foothills above Cole's land for 3 full years without saying a single word about what he saw. And it is the story of why he waited, because that answer, when it finally came, changes every year of the struggle that came before it. Cole was not a careless man. That matters here. He was not reckless with money, or lazy about work, or blind to what was happening on his land. He came to Nah-kah-yen County from the east with real skills and real conviction, and he broke ground on that stretch of New Mexico desert with the kind of confidence that comes from having always worked hard enough to make things go right. The land was not impressed. His first summer, the cattle came back thin. He adjusted his grazing rotation and blamed the heat. His second summer, they came back thinner. He drilled a well and pulled up water so alkaline his stock would barely drink it. He spent good money on a secondary irrigation channel. It dried up before August. He fenced new sections, pushed the herds north, bought better feed, hired on extra hands for the spring work. Every move was reasonable. Every move was what a knowledgeable man was supposed to do. And none of it held. By the end of his second year, Cole was operating at a loss he could not explain. His cattle were healthy. His land looked right. He was working harder than almost any man in that county. And he was still losing ground with every season that passed. What Cole could not have known, because no map he owned would have told him, and no neighbor had ever mentioned it, was that the north pasture was never going to respond to surface work. Not because the land was broken, because it was already being fed, had always been fed, from 20 feet below ground. A spring that had been pushing through the limestone shelf beneath that particular stretch of New Mexico earth for centuries. The water table that kept the surface soil alive was not where Cole could see it. It was where he had never thought to look. Nah-kah-yen knew about the spring. He had known about it his entire life. His father had known about it. His father's father had known about it. The Apache people had been reading the subsurface water of that region for generations, not as a useful trick, but as a deep and inherited understanding. The kind of knowing that comes from watching a piece of land through enough seasons that you stop thinking about what it might produce and start thinking about what it already is. For 3 years, Nah-kah-yen sat in those foothills above Cole's northern fence line and watched. Cole saw him up there dozens of times, a figure on horseback at the crest of a rocky rise, still, watchful. Cole read that stillness as indifference. Some days he read it as something closer to contempt. He wondered what the old man thought of the struggling operation below, all that visible effort producing so little. But he never rode up to ask. He did not feel he had earned the right to that conversation. And so 3 years went by. Cole dug and drilled and rotated and spent money he did not have. Nah-kah-yen sat above and watched. Neither man closed the distance between them. Then, on a Tuesday morning, in the middle of Cole's third spring, that changed. Cole was repairing fence posts along the north line at dawn when he heard hooves coming down the slope from the foothills. He turned and saw Nah-kah-yen riding toward him at an easy pace, without urgency, as if he had simply decided that this particular morning was the one, and that was all the reason required. Cole took off his hat. He straightened up and held it at his side and waited. Nah-kah-yen stopped his horse about 6 feet away. He looked at Cole for a long, quiet moment. Then he raised one hand and pointed at the ground near a cluster of scrub brush about 30 yards east along the fence line. Cole had passed that brush 1,000 times. It had always grown a little darker and a little fuller than anything else around it, and he had never once thought about why. 4 words, quiet and level and carrying no drama whatsoever, the way a man states something he has known for a very long time. The water is there. Then Nah-kah-yen turned his horse and rode back up the hill. Cole stood at the fence and stared at that patch of ground for a good long while. He doubted. He will tell you that plainly if you ask him. He stood there in the early morning light and thought about whether an old man had just pointed him toward salvation or toward 3 wasted days digging a dry hole. But he had already tried everything else. He got a post hole digger from the barn, and he started down. 4 feet, and the earth was the same clay he had been fighting for 3 years. 6 feet, and something in the color changed. 8 feet, and the smell changed too. Something close and mineral and different from anything the surface had ever given him. 10 feet. 11. His shoulder had gone numb, and his boots were soaked through with sweat. 12 feet. The shovel caught something that gave instead of resisted, and the difference came up through the handle before Cole's brain had fully understood it. The water rose slow at first, then faster, cold against his boots, darkening the walls, ancient and completely unhurried, the way something acts when it has been waiting and is in no particular rush about finally being found. Cole stood in the bottom of that hole for a long time before he climbed out. He sat on the ground beside the hole for the better part of an hour. He looked up at the foothills. The high ground was quiet. After a while he got up, walked to his horse, and rode toward the hills. Nah-kah-yen was sitting in front of his dwelling when Cole arrived. He did not appear surprised. Cole said what he had come to say, plainly and without performance. Not the kind of gratitude that needs an audience, but the kind that a man delivers quietly to another man when he means it without reservation. Nah-kah-yen listened until Cole was finished. He nodded once, and then he said 5 more words. You were not ready before. Cole rode back down the hill, a different man than the one who had ridden up. Because those 5 words were not an apology. They were not a justification for the silence, or an explanation of why the knowledge had been held back. They were something harder than any of those things. They were the truth, offered plainly, the way Nah-kah-yen offered everything. Cole had not been ready before, not because he lacked intelligence, and not because he was undeserving, but because a man who still has faith in his own answers cannot hear someone else's. It slides off him. He files it away or argues with it, or decides the other person does not fully understand his situation. He does not act on it. He cannot. He has not yet run all the way to the end of what he brought with him. 3 years of failure had done something to Cole that 3 years of success never could have. It had emptied him. Not broken him, but emptied him of certainty. Cleared out the self-assurance that had been filling up every corner where new understanding might otherwise have taken root. By the third spring, Cole was a man with his hands open. And Nah-kah-yen had recognized it, the same morning it became true. That spring changed the ranch completely. Within 2 seasons, the north pasture was producing grass more consistent and more sustaining than anything Cole had managed across 3 years of surface work. The cattle came back in the fall, heavier than they had ever been on that land. The alkaline well became a secondary concern rather than the only option. The land responded the way land always responds, when it finally gets what it was always missing. Cole worked that ranch for another 30 years. He and Nah-kah-yen developed the kind of relationship that does not need a lot of words, because the important thing had already been said. They greeted each other with respect. They shared an understanding about patience and land, and the particular education that only comes from running out of your own ideas in full sight of the cost. There is a kind of help in this world that cannot be given until someone is ready to receive it. Not because the person offering it is cold, and not because the knowledge is too difficult to share, but because knowledge handed to a man who still believes he already has the answer does not land as help. It lands as noise. It bounces off the certainty he is still wearing and disappears before it reaches anything that could use it. Nah-kah-yen did not save Cole's ranch. Cole's 3 years of struggle saved the ranch, because they were the price of becoming the kind of man who could finally hear 4 words, trust them completely, and go find out what they meant. The water was always there. Cole just had to become ready to dig for it.